Welcome back to Ancient Edge, where we unearth the extraordinary moments that history almost forgot. Today, we journey to a battlefield transformed, to a moment when the machinery of war ground to a halt, and humanity itself became the greatest act of defiance. Imagine this: the deafening roar of World War I artillery suddenly silenced, replaced by the gentle sound of Christmas carols drifting across frozen mud. Enemies who, moments before, were locked in a fight to the death, now sharing cigarettes and handshakes in the very wasteland that had claimed thousands of lives. How could such an impossible moment of peace erupt amidst the most brutal conflict in human history? This is the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914, when ordinary soldiers defied their orders, their nations, and the very logic of war itself. Beyond the barbed wire. A Christmas Eve paradox. Picture the Western Front on December 24th, 1914. The landscape is a hellscape of frozen mud, shattered trees, and coiled barbed wire, stretching as far as the eye can see. In waterlogged trenches, barely 100 yards apart, British and German soldiers huddle against the bitter cold, knowing that death could arrive at any moment from across that narrow strip of devastation known as No Man's Land. The constant crack of sniper fire and distant thunder of artillery had become the soundtrack of existence, a mechanical rhythm of industrialized slaughter that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in just 5 months of fighting. Yet as dusk began to fall on Christmas Eve, something extraordinary began to stir along miles of the front line. It started as a quiet rebellion, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps, just for one night, there could be something more than death and destruction. Despite explicit orders from high command to maintain combat readiness, and despite the propaganda that painted the enemy as inhuman monsters, humanity refused to be silenced. What followed would become, honestly, one of the most remarkable moments in the history of warfare. The transformation began with music. A single German voice rose from the trenches, carrying the familiar melody of Stille Nacht across the frozen wasteland. In the British trenches, soldiers who had been preparing for another night of vigilance found themselves listening to an enemy singing Silent Night. The response came naturally. British soldiers began to sing in return, their own carols joining the German voices in a strange, beautiful harmony. Then came the lights. Along the German parapets, small Christmas trees appeared, decorated with candles that flickered against the darkness like stars fallen to earth. These trees became beacons of an entirely different kind, illuminating not targets for killing, but the possibility of connection. Shouts of Merry Christmas in broken English crossed the divide. Laughter replaced the usual sounds of war. The first tentative steps out of the trenches required extraordinary courage. Yet now, unarmed and vulnerable, soldiers from both sides climbed over their parapets and walked toward each other. The first handshakes in that frozen wasteland were more than gestures of goodwill. They were acts of profound faith in shared humanity, each man gambling his life on the hope that the other would choose peace over duty. What happened next defied all military logic. Enemies became neighbors, sharing food, cigarettes, and small gifts across ground that hours before had been soaked with blood. German soldiers offered cigars and schnapps. British troops shared tins of bully beef and plum pudding. Buttons were cut from uniforms as souvenirs. Photographs were taken, creating impossible images. Sworn enemies standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling for the camera. The most iconic moment came when someone produced a football. On the very ground that had been a killing field, soldiers organized impromptu matches. These football games, played without proper goals or referees, represented something profound, a collective act of imagination, a shared decision to pretend just for a moment that they were simply young men enjoying Christmas rather than instruments of national slaughter. Soldiers who had been ordered to think of each other as monsters discovered they had far more in common than they had been told. They spoke of homes and families, showed photographs of loved ones, and found themselves recognizing their own hopes and fears reflected in the eyes of men they were supposed to kill. The enemy became human, and that recognition would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. The Christmas truce was never authorized. It was an act of mass insubordination, a grassroots rebellion that spread along miles of the Western Front through nothing more than the shared desire for a moment of peace. Officers on both sides found themselves, torn between maintaining military discipline and acknowledging the profound humanity they were witnessing. High Command was, honestly, horrified. Generals and politicians saw the truce as a dangerous breakdown in military discipline that threatened the very machinery of war. They worried that men who had shared Christmas dinner would be, unwilling to resume killing each other when ordered. They were right to worry. In subsequent years, measures were taken to prevent any recurrence. Artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas, troops were rotated, and officers were given explicit orders to prevent fraternization under threat of court-martial. The question that lingered as the truce ended and the killing resumed was, honestly, almost unbearable. If they could find peace for a day, why couldn't it last? The soldiers had proven that even in the depths of industrialized warfare, humanity could assert itself. And yet within days, those same men were back to trying to kill each other, bound by duty, nationalism, and the terrible machinery of a war that would drag on for 4 more years. The Christmas truce of 1914 lasted only briefly. In some sections, it ended after just a few hours. In others, it stretched into Boxing Day or even beyond. But eventually, the war resumed its terrible course. For the men who experienced it, the truce remained a defining moment, a glimpse of what could be possible if only humanity could triumph over the forces that drive nations to war. Yet the legacy of that extraordinary day extends far beyond the battlefield. The Christmas truce stands as evidence of our collective capacity for peace. Even in circumstances designed to erase every trace of humanity, it reminds us that orders can be disobeyed, that propaganda can be seen through, and that even in the darkest moments, human connection can break through the barriers we construct. In an age of increasing division, when we are constantly told to see others as enemies, the Christmas truce offers a different vision, that beneath the uniforms, the flags, and the rhetoric, we share far more than separates us. As we approach Christmas in 2025, over a century removed from that frozen battlefield, this story resonates with renewed urgency. It challenges us to question the narratives that divide us, to recognize our shared humanity, even in those we are told to oppose, and to believe that spontaneous acts of peace, however brief, are essential affirmations of who we are. If this journey into one of history's most remarkable moments has moved you, subscribe to Ancient Edge and join us as we continue to uncover the extraordinary stories that reveal the depths of human resilience and connection. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the darkest times, hope and humanity can prevail. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden knowledge that connects us all.